All right, well, everyone, good to be back here at Noahide Nations, and we're going to speak about, obviously, the Noahide laws. And now, we're going to hit an interesting topic. I mean, I think they're all interesting, but speak about what is considered the age of obligation. Right? Interesting thing, is it the same for Noahide as it is a Jew? Right? That's what we're gonna deal with. So, any code of law in general is not going to obligate anyone if they don't know what they're doing, right? If they don't know really what is expected of them. So obviously a child too young, not going to have expectations. Can't be bound by anything. Why? Too young. Right? They're too young. So, a child has to understand, and that's what we do. We educate our kids from a very young age of what's right and wrong, what their obligation is to others. Right? When a Jewish child starts learning Gemara for the first time, they learn the second chapter of b.The. What's the second chapter of b.The about? Second chapter is all about lost objects. What do you do when you have a lost object? Does it have a sign? It doesn't have a sign. I have to return it. I don't have to return it. All right, a lot of questions. Why do they learn that first? Why do they learn that piece of Talmud first? To understand the world's not ownerless. To understand their obligations. Right? What would we have thought? Finders keepers. Losers weepers. Right? That's what we would have thought. 100%. But there's an obligation. There might be an obligation to return it. You have to put up signs. If anyone, lost a certain thing or whatever. Or maybe you don't. Maybe, if it doesn't have a sign on it, doesn't look like it was left there purposely, then I don't have to return it. But children have to learn the world is not ownerless. Right? In other words, that the world, there's obligations. We have obligations. So the question would be, what's the age of obligation? That, a person would be bound by the Noahide laws. So not only important understanding the application of this, but also got to educate the youth. You need the youth to understand, what it means. So here, just like we spoke about abortion. There's a lot to learn, a lot to study about that. One of the later commentaries. Also, it's going to be complicated over here as well. A lot of ramifications. So according to the Torah, how do we determine the age of obligation? Maybe you tell me it's by intellectual development. Maybe you tell me it's intellectual development plus physical maturity. Right? Maybe physical maturity plays a role. So, it cannot be based on physical development alone. Why? Because then what about understanding? If a person doesn't have understanding, doesn't matter how physically developed they are. That would be irrelevant. Or maybe you'll tell me, third possibility, they go hand in hand. I need physical development and I need development in the mind. Right? They have to go hand in hand. Maybe. So the Torah says that for boys that have begun biological maturity, that's by the age of 13. Girls by the age of 12. So the two statuses. One is called a katan, a minor, under the age of 13 for a boy, under the age of 12 for a girl. And who's considered a gadol? An adult over 13 for a male, or 12 for a female. Right? So you have the status of what we call a katan, a minor, and a gadol. Now, what does the Torah say? Do we have anything direct in the Torah? So it could be, maybe, there are a number of hints over here. We see that by Adam, we just read yesterday, the first parsha, Genesis, that when Adam received the Noahide laws, how old was he? Not even a day. Wasn't even 1 day old. So you see, those younger than the biological age are obligated, have a certain level of maturity. Maybe you say a 1 day old baby by Adam, is like a 30-year-old today. Maybe we'll say that. But you see that even at a very young age. So the Sholem Meshiv, section 1, number 14, explains that the age of obligation, what's it based on? Based on understanding. Not based by age. Based on what a person knows. Now, this might be problematic, right, for a number of reasons. Because even if you go by chronological age, it's not the only determining factor here for a Noahide. Because Adam was created biologically mature, with full understanding. See, that's why, as the Gemara says, there's no room for evolution. We know evolution is false. But the Gemara says everything in creation was created in full form. Trees weren't planted, they grew. They redwood tree, God already put there, 100,000 feet in the air, whatever it is. Right? Animals created full maturity. Right? The first ones. So we know Adam was created biologically with full understanding. So he's 1 day old. Can't use that. So you could tell me, well, someone who's biologically, intellectually mature, I need both to be included in the mitzvahs. Right? That means for a girl over the age of 12 or a boy over the age of 13, maybe. But understanding's not enough. Maybe you could have someone who's a genius at the age of 7. Right? You have cases like that. You have someone who's like a genius at a very young age. They finish college by the time they're 12. Right? Whatever. I mean, it's not common, but it happens. So, maybe you tell me, understanding alone, not enough. Right? Because they don't have physical maturity. So, in such a case, even in this case by Adam, if he's born at full maturity, you can't use that as a proof. So this doesn't tell me anything. This doesn't give me any proof. So what about Shechem? It says the residents of the city of Shechem all put to the sword. They all died. Right? Because of what happened to Dinah. So the Rambam says the inhabitants of Shechem transgressed by not establishing the rule of law. Right? What does the Rambam say over here? Even the minors, seemingly, everyone was killed. They're all liable. So therefore, you see, a Noahide minor can be liable for the Noahide laws. Now, I'll just mention one thing, just as a side point. What happened over here? Dinah got violated. She got violated against her will. Come on, Shimon and Levi. They make up this guise. They say, well, we want you all to be circumcised, etc. Let you marry our daughters, blah, blah, blah. Then they massacre them. Right? They totally massacre them. What happened? Why did they get killed? So the Rambam says they didn't establish a rule of law. Meaning, Shechem was a big personality. What should they have done? Prosecuted him. They're not allowed to rape someone. Right? Goes against the Noahide laws. Gonna prosecute him. Maybe they were afraid. He's a big person. Government get involved. They should have prosecuted him. So what happened? They transgressed one of the Noahide laws. They didn't do anything with the law court here. So therefore, it deserved to be wiped out. Because everyone sat around, didn't do anything. Didn't everybody know about it? Oh, everybody knew. Everybody knew. And everybody was quiet. Got to set up law courts. Law courts are crucial. That's why he gets killed. That's why everybody gets killed. Even though, Yaakov said it wasn't a good thing for them to do. And they answered back and said, but what, our daughter, our sister, right, is going to be like, be abused over here. It's going to be, it's going to be like a prostitute over here. Forget it. They disagreed. Right? But, bottom line, people of Shechem get wiped out. Why? Because they didn't do anything. Everyone sat around and didn't do anything. Got to have law courts. Now, here is a different point. And that is, everybody got wiped out. Why the miners get wiped out? So, this possibility also mentioned by the Sholem Yeshiva. But if you look at Genesis chapter 35, verse 29, Shimon and Levi captured the tapos. What are the tapos? The young ones of Shechem. So you can't assume the miners were executed. Right? There are other possibilities also. So there's a whole question over here. When it says it wiped out the inhabitants of Shechem, does that mean miners also? The whole question here. Now, it says, Genesis chapter 34, verse 25. It says, Shimon and Levi, each ish, what is ish? A man, took his sword. Now, the word ish normally means someone important, and it means an adult. Who's that referring to? Shimon and Levi. Now, if you, at the time, of the chronological order here, of the Torah, how old was Levi at the time? He was 13. Very interesting. He's 13. The Torah calls him an adult, calls him an ish. That would make him the youngest person we called an adult in the Torah. The Rashi explains to Nazir 29b. Rashi says, what does this verse tell me? 13 is the age of maturity. And therefore, at the age of 13, there's an obligation of mitzvahs. And Rashi says this many times. Many, many times. In other commentaries, as well. It says in Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers, chapter 5, verse 21, in Sanhedrin 69b, mentioned a number of times. So what does Rashi understand? He understands 13. That's the benchmark age for biological intellectual maturity. Now, could be also, you look at Genesis chapter 25, verse 27, and it says, Vayigdalu Anarim, and the youth became adults. Who's that referring to? Yaakov and Esav. Now, according to this, Yaakov and Esav also would have been 13 at the time. So seemingly better proof than what we just said, Genesis 34:25. Right now, when you look at Rashi's commentary over here, verse 25, chapter 25, verse 27, so he understood what the implications were. Right, so the question is, if he understood it, why did he mention it there? Or why did he mention Genesis 34, verse 25 better? Why is that a better source? Good question. Right? We'll leave that for further investigation. But you could have used that verse also. So now, based on that, there are two opinions in the early commentaries. First, you got Rashi, which we already mentioned. Then you got the Rosh Rabbeinu Asher. And when you look at what they said, many ramifications, both for Jews and Noahides. Comes on Rashi and says, standard fact, what's the age? What's the age? 13. That's when they begin physical and mental maturity. In order to be obligated in the mitzvah. Now, I'll throw one curveball. The one curveball is, what happens if someone has delayed adolescence? They could have delayed adolescence. Could be. They don't have physical signs of maturity, but they have intellectual signs. Rashi stating unequivocally 13 is the age. 13 starts the age of physical maturity, as well as mental maturity. I'm just throwing out that what happens if you don't have physical maturity. There's some people develop a little bit later. Right? We'll have to see. Right? The question is, even if they develop a little bit later, could be there were certain things they'd be allowed to do, not allowed to do. Even if they have the mental maturity. So Rashi, well, a number of questions here. First of all, what is the minimal age for females? He only says for males. Not only that, it says a male of 13 is an adult. What about someone under the age of 13? Right? Do we just say ipso facto, the age of 13 becomes an adult? I.e., what if you're under the age of 13? Right? If you're under the age of 13, you're not an adult. That's what we would think, maybe. Or we say no. Maybe even 12 could be an adult. So the Rosh takes a different approach. The Rosh explains that the age of obligation for girls and boys are what we call a halacha Moshe Misinai, which means they're part of the rules of interpretation that the Torah is communicated on Sinai. Not necessarily mentioned directly in the text. There are a number of things that are what we call halacha Moshe Misinai. Just finished the holiday of Sukkot, right? Holiday of Sukkot, you have to build a sukkah. What's a sukkah exactly? 3 walls. 2 walls and part of another wall. Where do we learn it out from? The Gemara says, say halacha Moshe Misinai. Torah doesn't tell me. Right? So there are other examples like that. So the Rosh adds another point that is definitely going to affect all Noahides, and that is that in order to be liable and obligated in the mitzvahs, so I have a whole group of laws, of halachas, that are called shiurim. Literally what we call amounts. So what do we mean? In other words, how much, let's say, give an example, how much non-kosher meat that a Jew would eat is liable for punishment. What if he eats a tiny amount? Right, this big. Is he liable or not? No, as we understand, they're never commended in this. Right? The Rambam, Laws of Kings, Chapter 9, Halacha 9, it seems like it's a consensus of the rabbinic authorities. Doesn't apply. Doesn't apply to Noahides. So the Rosh says you can have the age of 12 and 13 for Jewish liability for the sake of amounts, right? What if they need a certain amount or drink a certain amount, then they might be liable. This does not apply to Noahides at all. 0 only applies to Jews. Now, what's the obvious question? What's the obvious question for the Rosh? How is he going to determine the age of obligation for Noahides? I understand for Jews. What about Noahides? The Rosh writes, this is in Hedron 69b, Prior to Mount Sinai, unbelievably, an 8-year-old could show signs of puberty. They'd be considered a man. Right? Implies the Rosh that before Mount Sinai, physical signs of maturity are enough. That's what it sounds like. Right? Not only that, women could give birth at the age of 6 or 7. Now, obviously, things have changed. But, when the Talmud says, someone had relations, let's say with a 3-year-old, and everybody goes nuts, and they say, what? 3-year-old, what are you doing with the 3-year-old over here? etc. The question is, does she remain a virgin? She doesn't. Does she get, what's her status? What's her status in marriage? A lot of different questions. People think that's absolutely ludicrous. The ones that even know this piece of Talmud, right? There are many places where it speaks about. So I remember, in controversial issues, spoke about this crazy things that the Gemara says, right? This is one of them, right? Seemingly crazy, right? So what was one of the answers? One of the answers is, first of all, we're not saying that, that's something we wanted to happen. They're talking about cases where it happened. Man with the woman, she's this age, what are the ramifications? Right? Not that we're advocating it, but it happened. So now we have to understand what the status is. Can she marry a Kohen? Whatever, a lot of different things. Right? But the second point is that, you're going to say a 3-year-old, what can a 3-year-old do? What do they know? This, that, that's inconceivable. Seems impossible to understand. We just answered that. If it's possible they could show signs of puberty at the age of 8, or give birth, let's say, at that age, or even younger. So if you say a 3-year-old, maybe a 3-year-old is like a 14-year-old. Regardless whether, science has proven it that or not, we don't really care what science has to say. Right? Because even if it's never been proven, right, like many things, doesn't mean not true. Give one example. That Jews are not allowed to eat certain animals. One of the reasons given, potential reasons, is that we are what we eat. So we don't want to eat an animal that is carnivorous, that traps other animals, that, rips to shreds other animals. Why? Because that could have a negative connotation for us when we eat it. In other words, we're affected by what we eat. That doesn't apply to non-Jews. In other words, we take in the soul of that animal. Now, does that mean we're going to start doing other things? Okay, it hasn't been proven by science. Some of the commentaries use that as an answer why we don't eat certain animals. The animals we do eat are all vegetarians that we're allowed to eat. Right? So I'm always fond of saying, guess what? Just because science hasn't proven it doesn't mean it's not true. Because there are a lot of things out there science hasn't proven. And even things that they do know is a drop in the bucket. It's a total drop in the bucket. Who's to say they won't discover it later? Maybe they will. Maybe they won't, even if they don't. So what? It's a possibility. Right? That's the point. It's a possibility. So here, prior to Mount Sinai, an 8-year-old could show signs of puberty. So according to that, what is the Rosh learning? I don't need intellectual understanding. I need physical signs of maturity. Comes along the Chavatzelis Asharon. Right? Commentary on the Torah that goes with many halachic issues on the Parsha. And he explains Genesis chapter 34, verse 25. So he goes according to what the main issue is between the Rashi and the Rosh. How to understand what the word ish means. Does ish imply overall maturity? I.e., who's a gadol, who's considered an adult? Or are you going after physical maturity? Meaning, one is only an ish, not a gadol, maybe. Rashi understands ish in the former. The Rosh goes in the latter case. Now, what's the $2 million question we have to answer here? What are the ramifications for Noahide? According to Rashi, if the halacha is like him, then the age of 13 is the age of obligation for a Noahide as well as a Jew, right? For Jewish men. We'll get to Jewish women. Comes along the Rosh, then the age of 12 or 13, right, are not relevant over here. The Noahides. What's it determined by? Comprehension alone. Not connected to physical chronological benchmarks. Now, I'll throw out one other thing. One other thing I forgot to mention. What about a child, God forbid, that's mentally challenged? Do they have the same obligations? So you say, well, they could have physical maturity. They could definitely show signs of physical maturity, right? Even if that's true, mentally they're not there. Mentally, they have the IQ of someone like this 25 IQ. They don't understand things. So we hold they're not, you do what you can with them, but they're not liable like everybody else because they're lacking understanding. Physical maturity they may have, okay? Not the only thing, though. Right? So the Rosh learns comprehension alone is not connected to physical chronological benchmark. So these are different ramifications. Comes along the later commentaries, the Acharonim, and you got to discuss over here the a.Chasam Sofer. a.Chasam Sofer, known as Ramosha Shriver. Shriver means to write. Sofer means to write. So he was asked the following question. That there was a sale of a Jew's cow to a non-Jew. Now the Jew thought the non-Jew was older. Turned out the non-Jew was only 9. Even though he's only 9, it's pretty big for a 9-year-old. Well, the question is, if he's 9 but he's very big, is the sale valid? So the a.Chasam Sofer goes like the Rosh. That the boy was mature enough and he understands about the sale, then the sale is valid. Right? Then the sale will be valid. Comes along the Sholem Eshiv, the Minchas Chinuch. He also goes like the Rosh. Right? Also goes like the Rosh. There are a whole bunch of questions. Whole bunch of questions on it. But many other later commentaries had questions. Questions on the Rosh. Right? One is that the age of the majority is included in amounts and measures. That's questionable. Right? That is extremely questionable. Right? We'll give an example. By all other amounts, we have a concept called chetzi shir asamina Torah. Meaning, if I have half the amount, it's still forbidden. It's still forbidden, even if I don't eat or drink the full amount. Right? But the amount of greatness of how big the person is, so to speak, had nothing to do with the obligation of half an amount or not. Right? That's only rabbinical when it comes to education of the parents. What are we going to say? Half over here? It doesn't make any sense. Right? It doesn't make any sense. You can't compare one thing to another. Over here. It's not comparable. Right? Definitely not comparable. Over here. So when we look at the age of 12 and 13, that they come, it's Halacha Moshe Sinai, comes from Mount Sinai, totally independent of anything biological, anything to do with maturity. They do impact, certainly, the age of obligation for Jews, right? But who says it's comparable at all for Noahides? Right? So it makes more sense according to Rashi. Right? Even though, it's a big discussion over here. It would make more sense. Right? So now, why would we say, in general, that the obligation for Jews is tied to that age, the 12 and 13? Why not bring in the factor of development? Well, the opposite applied to Noahides. So in the case, you might say, well, if that would be the case, maybe you have a situation where you have a Noahide law being more stringent than Jewish law, and that you don't have. You don't have a law that by non-Jews is more stringent than us, in general. All right, that has to be understood. Comes on the Rambam, and he understands the age of obligations like Rashi. Goes like Rashi, not like the Rosh. The Gaon of Rogatchov, of Yosef Rosen, had a lot of questions on the Rosh. In one of his responses, he held against the Rosh in favor of Rashi, that 13 and 12 are ages of obligation for Noahides as well as for Jews. Now, what about other commentaries? What about the Rambam? Seemingly, people have argued the Rambam both ways, supporting Rashi and the Rosh. Now, if you want to say, well, maybe it goes like the Rosh, it's an inference, at best. Many later commentaries say that really the Rambam goes like Rashi. Why? What did the Rambam say? The Rambam says the child from time of birth until the age of 13 is called a minor. It's called the Katan. In the same section, he says, we've defined herein 20 terms pertaining to the stage of age of obligation. So you keep those terms in mind, don't forget their meaning, so that their intent will not have to be explained whenever they're mentioned elsewhere. In other words, remember what we said over here, you're going to apply it to many other things. But when you talk about liabilities for transgressing the Noahide laws, the Rambam says a katan, a minor, is never punished. Right? Laws of Kings, chapter 10, halacha, never punished. So you see, it's got to be the age of 13. So the Rambam understood the obligation for Noahides to be 13, just like Jews. So many other rabbinical authorities held that. So the Rambam seems to go like Rashi. That's the way it sounds. So now there's a question. Okay, we spoke about an ish, men. What about an isha? What about a woman? If we say, we go like Rashi, and we assume the age of obligation is what? Is 13 for men. What's that going on? Developmental reality. So how do we know obligation for girls? So again, what are we going like? We're going to go physical and intellectual maturity. So we can assume this is slightly earlier for girls. Why? Because that's the way of the world. The Gemara says explicitly, women reach maturity earlier than men. In fact, we established the age of 12 is the obligation for women. Now, interesting enough, we're all men here anyway, at least listening right now. So we know this is a biological fact. Women mature earlier than men. Right? I don't think there's any argument over here. Now, could some women mature a little bit earlier? Maybe. But usually it's around that age. Around that age. Now, there's another issue over here. Right? I got a couple issues here. There's another issue. What about conversion? What about converting a minor? You take a minor who's 2 years old. Parents convert. Or let's say the mother converts. Child converts with the mother. Child doesn't know anything. Child knows zero. The halacha is a minor not considered mature enough to adopt the mitzvahs. That's what we said. It's part of, also it's part of the conversion process. That, you shouldn't be allowed to convert them. So therefore, the conversion is only conditional up until the age of 12 or 13. Right? Meaning that at that age, if the child was converted as a child, the Beis Din will contact them and ask them if they want to continue. Because now they have understanding. Do they want to continue being a Jew? Now, they have a choice. They can say yes, they can say no. Right, but right now they understand. Right, so it's conditional. They're allowed to convert even as a child. But they're going to be asked as an adult, is this really what do you want to do? And they can say, you know what, I don't like this, I'm out. They can do that. Their choice. But you have to ask them at that age. So, if a Noahide is considered a halachic adult, even at an earlier age, why should their acceptance not be considered valid? Right? In other words, you take someone who matured at the age of 9, and they convert. They're an adult. So why is it conditional? Shouldn't be conditional. So there's doubt as to the validity of a minor's acceptance of the mitzvahs. That would create unbelievable problems over here. Because what could the child say? As an adult, I'm out of here. I'm not interested. They'll reject it. They'll reject this conversion as an adult. Comes on the Ritva, one of the early commentators. And when he speaks about conversion, right, Teksuvis, page 11, he goes like Rashi. He says it's going to be 12 or 13. But, this is a big issue. This is a very big issue. Because, first of all, how do you have a conditional conversion? That's a whole discussion. Meaning that you put in a condition and say, okay, we're going to accept you. You can convert, do everything you need to do, but you have to fulfill this condition. Now, what happens if you don't fulfill the condition? If you don't fulfill the condition, then everything you did up until this point is invalid. The blessings you made, invalid. All the Shabbos you kept, invalid. All these mitzvahs you did now as a non-Jew. All these things, a lot of ramifications. That's a serious problem. Now, whether we go like the Rosh or Rashi, everyone agrees the age of 12 or 13 is an important milestone. That's clear. That is clear. Because at that point, a girl or a boy is going to be fully obligated in the Noahide laws at that point. Right? Like Rashi. So therefore, it can be celebrated as a milestone. It's a big milestone. Right? Accepting the Noahide laws. Now, again, accepting Noahide laws, so I have to go in front of a rabbinical court to do it? No. Is it a good thing to do in front of a witness and say, yeah, accept them? Okay. Person wants to do it, get a big plaque for it, they can do it. Makes them feel good. etc. But it is a milestone. Even for most Jews, secular Jews, a girl will have a bat mitzvah, a boy will have a bar mitzvah, right? More bar than mitzvah, get it? More bar than mitzvah. Because afterwards they have this big party and that's it. Leave your Jewish education at home, and that's it. Most kids don't understand what the whole thing's about anyway. They have a certain level of maturity, it's true. But if they grew up living it, that's a whole different thing. Because they understand what their obligations, they understand what the Torah wants from them. If you get a half-baked education, Jewish education, come out half-baked. You're not going to understand it. It's all a big party. That's it. You have some sort of theme for the party, maybe, whatever. Parents spend a lot of money. That's it. Jewish education finished. If you got any Jewish education at that point. But it is a milestone. There's no question about it. You know what they did in Europe? In Europe, kids became bar mitzvah. You know what their kiddush was? Give them a little bit of herring, a little bit of fish. That's it. They have a lavish party. They don't have anything. They have money. They're dirt poor. Then someone will say, well, I never had a bar mitzvah. I never had a bat mitzvah. So what? And, that doesn't matter. It goes by maturity. So even if you weren't formally called to the Torah, okay? Does that invalidate the bar mitzvah? Doesn't invalidate it at all. It goes by age, right? Level of maturity, understanding. People say, well, I wasn't never bar mitzvah. Okay, so what? Doesn't change anything. You're still obligated to mitzvahs 20 years later, 30 years later, whether you had one or not. Irrelevant. It is a milestone. Clear. It's a milestone. But see, the milestone has to be understood. And, for every child, every Orthodox child, it's a big day. It's a huge day. Get called to the Torah. You're now part of the minyan, right? You're part of the quorum. So now they have the obligation. They got to pray 3 times a day and all that. But it's something they look forward to. It's a huge milestone. But see, kids who are brought up with it, they understand what it is. Because they've been living it their whole lives. So it's much more real. Someone else goes to an afternoon Hebrew school twice a week and they don't want to be there. The teachers don't want to be there. And they're getting a little smidgen of this, a smidgen of that. It's more bar than mitzvah. That's what it is. I grew up with it, I can tell you. Whatever, you have this big party. So I was growing up, what was the big thing? The hustle. Dun, 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 dun. You remember the song, The Hustle. Right, so whatever, it's a whole big party. And then that's it. It's funny. I guess I'll end with this. I was contacted, a month ago. A month and a half ago. Someone I grew up with. And, we used to have lead services, my parents' synagogue. It's like reminiscing, like the good old days. And he still goes there. I mean, synagogue's been pretty much dead. It hasn't officially died, but it's pretty much dead. It's like, reminiscing a little bit. So I was like, okay. It's very sad, but, it's got some connection to Judaism. I mean, it's worth something, I guess. But, at the end of the day, it's what you take from it. Bar mitzvah is a milestone. Question is what you do with it. What potential you do with it. If you grow up with it, you continue doing what you're doing. You're going to learn. You're going to continue to learn. Etc. You didn't grow up with it. You go to synagogue here, go to synagogue there. That's it. Right? A milestone it is. There's no question. But even if it's a milestone, it's all about the party afterwards. All right, so you got called to the Torah, you read a little bit Hebrew, maybe you led the service a little bit. Okay, that's it. People make these extravagant things for nothing. Kid doesn't get it. Parents want to have a good feeling about Judaism. So I tell you, if you want to have a good feeling about Judaism, don't send your kids to Hebrew school. Because most kids that go to Hebrew school hate it. It's after school, it's 2 hours, twice a week, or whatever it is. They don't want to be there. They want to be playing with their friends, doing other things. Makes perfect sense. So trying to give them a smidgen of it. Right? But in the Orthodox world, kids in, 7th, 8th grade, they're going to school till 6, 7 o'clock at night. Learning all day long. Learning it, living it, breathing it. It's a whole different thing. Totally different thing. The joke is, and it's a very sad joke. The joke is, a secular Jew, how often do they use their Hebrew name? 4 times in their life. When they're born, when they're bar mitzvah, when they get married, when they die. Next stop, assimilation. That's what it is. That's the world we live in. Sad, but that's the world we live in. So for Noahides, it makes sense. Celebrate as a milestone. Does that mean you have to have a lavish party, this and that, put yourself in debt? Certainly not. Right? But it's a milestone. Definitely have people come over. I mean, it's a big thing. It should be made into something. Again, I'm not saying you have to go rent a hall and this and that, whatever, but it's definitely a milestone. Definitely a milestone, which is going to involve as well formal acceptance of the Noahide laws. That's an important thing. Definitely an important thing. And if it's done right, let's say people grew up with it and they're learning about it, and we've already established communities, which we haven't done yet, right? But in the future, then you grow up with it. You see how the people, kids start from the beginning. That's a whole different world. We live in a messed up world for that right now. Okay, try and fix it to whatever we can. But the reality is, imagine kids grow up with it, and you have a community of like-minded people. That's a whole different thing. And then they're waiting to that day where they can take on formally the Noahide laws. That's a big thing. Right? Not making fun here. That's a big thing. It should be taken seriously. It's something to look forward to. So it makes sense. It makes sense to celebrate. Again, a person can celebrate however they want. You want to make something more lavish? Okay. Right? You're not going to say, oh, isn't that making a new religion? Isn't that doing like what Jews do? No. There's no obligation. Does a Jew have an obligation to make a lavish party for his kid when he gets bar mitzvah? No. What's the importance? He turns 13. He's called to the Torah. Maybe he'll read from the Torah. That's it. He'll throw candy, whatever. That's it. But we don't want to shortchange him. Right? A person will make a kiddush. Maybe they'll have a separate night. People come, wish mazel tov, whatever. Okay? It's not a small thing. It doesn't have to be lavish. But it's a milestone. It's definitely a milestone. I'm just saying, people who live it, they grow up with it, they breathe it, they're looking forward to the day. Right? What are they looking forward to? When they can wear a hat and jacket. When they can get their hat. That's what kids look forward to. Some people look at it and say, that's nuts. These kids, 13 years old, as short as they may be or whatever, someone will say they look like little old men. Wearing hats and jackets. Okay, that's the uniform. In the outdoor Orthodox world, that's the uniform. But their kids said, extremely excited because they've been brainwashed. No, it's a milestone. It's a big milestone. Now I'm part of the minyan. Now I'm counted. Now it's all for real. That's a different issue. Now they got more obligations, okay? Right? But now they're more part of things, not just a kid. I mean, they still are a kid to a certain extent, but they're looked at now as an adult. And once they're looked at as an adult, now they have more what to say, right? More what to do. That's a huge thing. That's a huge thing. If we had set up, Noahide communities also, you make a big thing about it. It's not a small thing over here. Right? But it has to be done right. Can't be ostentatious, etc. But it's a milestone, right? It should be looked 100%. It should be looked at, as a milestone and celebrated accordingly. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there. I have a whole chapter, actually. Anyone wants my ebook? I have a whole chapter about the Hebrew school drudgery, so to speak. I happen to enjoy Hebrew school when I was growing up, but most people hated it, right? And that's why most people, if they went to Hebrew school and they still became religious afterwards, it'd be an absolute miracle because most people couldn't stand it. They didn't want to be there and, whatever. But although a few people actually liked it, but, for different reasons. Any case, any questions on any of that about the age difference between the Rosh and Rashi and how the Rambam learns and all that? Any questions on any of that? Ray, I feel bad. You can only type with one hand. You're going to be typing like this. You shouldn't make fun. Okay, very good. That sounds like a plan. Yeah, you got an off question topic. Go ahead. If you don't want to type it in, just unmute yourself. There's no Noahides and others around us affected by our mitzvahs. If so, how much? So, Ray made a statement a long time ago. I don't know if Ray remembers, but Ray made a statement that if there be more Noahides in the world, that would end anti-Semitism, which I humbly disagree. Right? I said it would help. It would definitely help, no question. Right? Would it eradicate anti-Semitism? No. And the reason is because Esav hates Yaakov. And that is going to be forever until the Messiah comes. Now, so that doesn't really answer the question. The question is, are we affected? Are other people affected? So we say that what Jews do can affect others in a positive or negative way. Right? Jews, the Gemara says, we're all intertwined. We're all intertwined. So therefore, if a Jew does something wrong, all Jews get blamed. Whether a Jew did it, a secular Jew or a religious Jew, doesn't really matter. Right? But the problem is a non-Jew. Imagine an Italian in Brooklyn, right, would do something wrong. Something egregious. What are we going to say? Burn down Italy? Going to burn down the flag? No more cannolis. Never happened. We don't say non-Jews are intertwined with non-Jews. On the other hand, if there were more non-Jews that acted like non-Jews should act, halavai, and keep the Noahide laws, we'd look different. 100%. Right? Do they have the same effect as we do? No, not necessarily. But in numbers, they can have a greater effect. That for sure. They could have a greater effect. Right? If there were more Noahides exponentially, sure, it'd be a different world. Right? Totally different world. We gotta work cut out for us. But in numbers it can affect. But in general, the Ramchal says in Derech Hashem, they don't affect things like we do. So they don't have that level of effect. But if they would have numbers, in greater numbers, that would for sure have an effect. Right? 100% would have an effect. Because then other people see what their purpose is, what the purpose of the Jewish people is, the world looks different, totally different. But their actions alone don't have that same effect. That's what I would say. How about affecting our family, though? That's for sure. It can have an effect, but I would say the hardest people to affect are family and friends. Why? Because they see you in a different context. Before they're going to see, hey, you used to do this, you used to do that, you used to do the other thing. Why are you telling me I should be a Noahide? And why are you giving me this propaganda? Right? It's hard to affect. There are families, I dealt with a number of people that they're in the process of conversion. I don't think Noahide is going to be any different here. They're in the process of conversion. It might be a little bit different. But they're in the process of conversion and their parents are anti-Semites. You think you got it hard? Imagine if your parents were totally anti-Semites. Siblings are anti-Semites. And you're going through this process, whether it's a Noahide or a JIT, a Jew in training. That's kind of hard. Very hard. So I've spoken about this a lot. How you deal with family and friends. And sometimes, there's a whole question. If I say something, whatever, maybe, they're going to hate Judaism more. It's going to be a desecration of God's name. Right? So someone says, I don't agree. I think, the Torah's anti-pig and anti-homosexual and anti-all these things. Goes against my agenda. Like, they ask us, it's really true, this, that, and the other thing. You say, yes, you're not allowed to eat pig. Oh, that's terrible. They start making fun. They start blaspheming against the Torah. Right? Did a person who answered that way, did they just desecrate a Torah prohibition, maybe putting a stumbling block in front of someone? What's the answer? No. Putting a stumbling block in front of someone means you take someone who made the Nazirite vow. You can't make a Nazirite vow today because you can't bring sacrifice. After. So, what's a Nazirite? Nazirite means that you have somebody who makes a vow. They can't eat grapes, can't drink grape juice, wine, can't go in the cemetery. I'm sure that's going to bother a lot of people. Right? So, if you had a Nazirite at your house, you can't put a bottle of wine in front of him. That's putting a stumbling block. Right? That you're not allowed to do. But if I say something and someone else gets offended, oh, that offends me. You quoted exactly what the Torah says. They're offended by the Torah. That's not my problem. I didn't transgress over here. Someone who's into marriage says, I think the Torah is this, and it doesn't mean that, and it's terrible. It's discriminating against non-Jews. You know what the answer to that is? Okay. They didn't ask me anything. It's a statement. You don't have to answer a statement. Everyone's going to start saying, no, you don't know what it means. They didn't ask you a question. They ask you a question. If I were to say that this goes against, what I believe, and it's discriminatory against, non-Jews, what would you say? Okay, that's a question. You have to see if it's a question or a statement. Statement I can't answer. That's you can't answer an answer. Right? But, dealing with, we can have a positive effect, we, God forbid, can have a negative effect. At the same time, we got to be careful. And it could be, what would happen if, a person didn't exactly smile the same way, or they smirked, or something, and someone gets offended. You got to be careful. We have to be careful. At the same time, person has to realize, okay, we're not perfect. And if someone gets the wrong impression by their own fault, not by what we said, I don't have to worry about that. Right? Because a number of people ask me, oh, I'm gonna fry because that's desecration of God's name, not in the technical, not the technical way, not the technical issue over here. We're not going to get into, but people throw it around. Oh, it's desecration of God's name, means it's a bad thing. Yeah, I agree. It's a bad thing, let's say. You didn't do anything wrong. They start taking things and say, oh, you think this and you think that. Sometimes the only thing you can do is damage control. I'll give one example. I had a relative that, was the last woman, that I ever danced with at a wedding. Right? So, I know it came up, I became religious, came up in conversation once, about, if I would see her, you wouldn't give me a hug and a kiss? Now, she's a blood relative. Person's a blood relative. Who's the Jew allowed to hug and kiss? Mother, father, right? Sister, brother, child, grandparent. That's it. Aunts, uncles, cousins, not allowed to. Right? Some would say you have to give up your life before you do it. That's how severe it is. So this person opened up their mouth, really opened up their mouth. You're going to say, you said something to deserve it. I didn't say anything to deserve it over here. And they said, if you wouldn't give me a hug and a kiss, don't even bother calling me. Don't even bother talking to me. Boy, aren't you so open-minded? What happened to being open-minded over here? If I was a Sikh, if I was a Hindu or something, they would respect it. If they would walk into a non-kosher Japanese restaurant, they take off their shoes, you better believe it. Because otherwise they won't eat there and they're going to sit on the floor. That they respect. Your quote-unquote medieval laws they don't respect. But that's what the person said. I never spoke to them again. They're lost. Right? But that was the condition. You want to speak to me, you're going to give me a hug and a kiss. You don't give me a hug and a kiss, I'm not going to speak to you. Right? Come on, keep grandma kissing. Right? Kind of being closed-minded. So what do? I'll tell you another situation. I was at a mourner's house that I went to many years ago. I had a relative, an elderly relative, a woman. It was very awkward. She wanted to give me a hug and a kiss. I took 2 steps back. But someone made a snide comment under their breath, which I heard. And, basically they said, what are you, crazy? This person, this person's so old. They're in their 80s. The person was in their 80s. They're so old and this and that. What are you doing? How could you offend somebody like that? What the person said. What am I going to answer? No, you can understand. Forget it. Damage control. Damage control. Right? This other cousin of mine, I tried to joke about it different ways. No dice. No dice. They just put me in my place. And that was it. This other person, okay, they understood, sort of. But what are you going to do? Forbidden. Doesn't matter how old they are. I don't know if they're old and creaky, whatever. Bones ache or whatever. So what? It could be 80, it could be 90, it could be 70. Who cares? You're not allowed to touch them. Period. Not even allowed to give them a fish handshake. One of these fish handshakes. You're going to say, come on. You're really going to get excited giving a fish handshake? No. Doesn't matter. What's forbidden is forbidden. So yeah, if we're going in the right path, we can have positive influence. Certainly we can have positive influence. Same time, some people just don't want to hear. They're not interested. Do what you want. Don't tell me. I'm not interested. Family and friends is very hard. Very hard. And a lot of times they go by the wayside. But if we do positive things and they see positive things, okay. But I can tell you, people see positive things, they won't attach it to the fact that you're keeping Torah mitzvahs. They won't say that. Certainly not, obviously, because if they say that, they're not keeping Torah mitzvahs, then what? They have to admit what they're wrong. So whatever, this is a common theme. Common topic comes up over and over. Right? For me, it comes up over and over because, people ask, dealing with family, dealing with friends. And most times in this process, it's very lonely. As a JIT, as a Jew in training, or as a Noahide, doesn't matter. Families can reject you out of hand. Even the secular Jew becomes religious, family can just totally reject you. I can tell you what happens. It happens probably more often than not. Sometimes whole families come together. That's beautiful. A lot of times, it doesn't happen. Give another example. friend of mine I went to college with, and his parents, he became religious, his parents cut him off. Totally cut him off. His father never met his wife and his kids, and his mother recently, last number of years, finally met his wife and kids. Boy, that's being open-minded. He has a connection, some level of connection. But that's what usually happens. Usually, family and friends go by the wayside. They don't want to hear about it. You're going to say it can have a positive influence. True. It can happen. I'm not going to say, no, it's beautiful when it happens. But, has been ingrained in my head, expect nothing, whatever you get is a bonus. Right? It's a pretty lame thing to say. But, when it comes to family like that, forget it. We can have a positive influence. But a lot of times it's, they're upset by what you represent, even if you don't say anything. They just, they're saying, I'm also Jewish. I do what I do, blah, blah, blah. And you have to respect it, like they ram it down your throat. They can say whatever they want. You can't say anything back. You have to be respectful. They don't have to be. It's very hard, I can tell you. I can write books on this. Totally write books on this. Because all these things happen to me. Get made fun of. People say things. They don't care. They say, yo, you're so sensitive. This, that. Right. I was in a bagel place. Once. I had a relative who said, come on, isn't keeping kosher all about trichinosis? Yeah, I didn't know. We're not eating meat. This is a bagel. What does that have to do with trichinosis? I get it. Things aren't heated up. Weren't heated up as well. People got sick. This, that. But that has nothing to do with kashrus. That was my 3-second answer. Because I wouldn't be given any more time. And they're like, whatever, pass the salt. Or someone says if I breathe on your food doesn't mean it's not kosher. Like, we need this like I need another hole in the head. Right? So I said, yeah, it's kosher. It just means it has bad breath on it. Next. I just slam the person. That was a good answer, I thought. What do you answer? What do you answer this? Family can be an albatross. An albatross. If family comes along, it's a huge thing. If they don't come along, expect it. Does that mean we can't have positive influence? Doesn't mean that. We could have positive influence. But, we have to be the best we can be as a JIT, a Noahide, or a Jew. So, we're not doing what we're doing so people can pat us on the back. We do what we do because of what God says. This is what the Torah says. Now, if they say, wow, look at how courteous they are. Thank God his Rebbe taught him Torah. Thank God his parents taught him Torah. Very good. But you can also desecrate God's name also. Even by something minor. As Rashi says in Yuma, that if a person learns from your bad actions. Your bad actions, that's a desecration of God's name. Not technical definition, but that can be a desecration of God's name. You see what looks like an Orthodox Jew that cut you off on the road. You visibly look like an Orthodox Jew, that's going to be bad. Doesn't matter why you're in a rush, whatever. That's bad. Person pushes the line, that's bad. We got to be exemplary. Because you don't want to give them an inch to say anything. Not one thing. Because you do something wrong, that's it. Then they're going to label you, they're going to label all Jews, or whatever. It's all Jews are interrelated. So we got to be careful. So what about a Noahide? You're also going to be careful. They're not going to know anything about a Noahide, whatever, but you want to show that you're exemplary. That you're living life the way you should. It's not an easy thing. They're not going to say, oh, all these Noahides, blah, blah. They don't know what a Noahide is. The Jews have a greater responsibility, much greater responsibility. I wish more people took it seriously. I was want to give another example. I was once in the supermarket, and someone just barreled it. They're in a shopping cart, barreled into me. I wasn't in the greatest of moods at the time. And I'm like, no. I'm like, what are you doing? He was like, what's the problem? I was like, what do you mean, what's the problem? You just went 45 miles an hour and slammed your cart into me. I was just standing there. What do you think? I was part of the fruit stand? This guy just looked at me. He just looked at me like I had 3 heads. Oh, stupid American. I deserve to be barreled over in a shopping cart? Yeah, so God wanted me to work on my anger. Very good. Failed. Got an F in that. You gotta be kidding. Person didn't think there was anything wrong. Personal hygiene, one of my also favorites. Person coughing up a storm. Cover your mouth, for goodness sakes. So why don't people do it? Either they were never taught or they don't care. They don't care. How can they not care? I don't know. I don't have any answer. I don't even have a bad answer. Ray, you're going to love that. I don't even have a bad answer. People are stupid. What can you do? So we're our own worst enemy. We're out there. You know, someone rips somebody off and they come back and say, how could you do that? You're an Orthodox Jew. And they say, who told you to put, you know, Orthodox Jew on such a high pedestal? Never say that. That's the desecration of God's name. You're going to say it's permissible to rip people off when you get caught? Or someone goes up to a great rabbi and he says, I have certain clothing that's grade A, grade B, grade C. So I want to sell it all as grade A, right? Certain cloth. The rabbi looks at him and goes, I don't understand the question. So he said it slower, a little bit louder. So he stopped him. He said, I understood the question. It's stealing. Why do you think it's permissible? He goes, a friend of mine was there. And this person answered, Rabbi, that's business. Business to rip people off? There are certain places in America, you know, if you're involved in a certain occupation, they won't have anything to do with you. Because they know some Orthodox Jews have given such a bad reputation. You could be clean as a whistle, they'll have nothing to do with you. You bad eggs ruin everything. So we got to try and be as squeaky clean as possible. So we can have a positive effect. I'm not saying not. Right? But, you know, the problem I have is people say, wow, you know, you got such a beautiful family, this, that. They don't equate it with the education they got. They can't. Because if they say that, then they say, well, what about what we do? What about how we grew up? What about, you know, they see them as being rejected. So I get it. I think it's annoying, but, you know, I think deep down they really know. You know, but at the same time, you know, at the same time that, yeah, the quote-unquote conservative rabbi's wife, my wife became religious, you know, told my mother-in-law, I said, yeah, I'm here for you if you want to speak. I feel your pain. She didn't exactly say that, but like, she's like, I'm here for you. Like, you know, I was like, she joined the cult. All of a sudden became a Sikh. Something like that. Nuts. You know, I got plenty of people still think I'm nuts. I grew up with. Okay? You know, what my Rebbe say? Go eat kugel, you don't like it. Okay, you don't like it. You know, that family drop us like a hot potato. Okay. Well, you know, what are you going to do? You got to stand up for the Torah. You don't like it. Not much you can do. They'll admit, oh, I got a beautiful family, this and that, but like, you know, they're like, we're just as valid. We're just as good. It's not about being just as valid or not. You keep the Torah or you don't keep the Torah. You don't keep the Torah, fine. Just say, I don't keep the Torah, and that's it. But you're not telling me it's not true because you don't have any proof. It's another thing. People talk out of their elbow. They don't know anything. They don't know anything. You know, if someone told me, oh, the next world, I'm not worried about that. Really? You're not worried about it. Well, I think you should be worried about it. Right? So, oh, I'm not worried about that. Like, oh, come on. You know, that's just, you know, if people have faith. Oh, really? You studied, you studied philosophy on the subject? You know, Socrates, Aristotle? No. You study Jewish philosophy. Right? You study, you know, the Rambam, Yehuda Levi? No. Do you read the Bible from cover to cover? No. So why are you giving an opinion on something you don't know anything about? You're an idiot. You know, but they throw things like so definitive, you know, that like, oh, you know, you don't know. My opinion is just as valid. Why is your opinion just as valid? You're not giving me any information. You're just telling me, oh, that's what I think. Who cares what you think? Doesn't matter. I'm going to take what they say seriously. They never learned. They never studied. They never opened up a chumash in their life. I have a PhD. Pilot higher and deeper, or Papa has dough. You like that one, Ray? Papa has dough. Got a PhD in Judaism. You want to argue with a PhD? I mean, could. Now, I'm not saying I'm a world expert in everything. But it's crazy. It's crazy. Imagine someone read an article on Wikipedia about physics, and all of a sudden they're gonna say, "I'm gonna knock off Stephen Hawking, greatest physicist of our day." Yeah, I'm gonna knock him off. One article. Do me a favor. Someone used to say something stupid when I was in camp. They'd say, learn the rules, play the game, practice. They wouldn't say you're outright an idiot. That's what they would say. Right? But you see that in Judaism all the time. People make comments. They say they don't know anything. They don't know anything. I just mentioned one other thing. Here in Israel, there was a complaint. There was a complaint. They make the conversion test way too hard. Right? Way too hard. What way too hard? One of the questions they asked is, who is Moshe Rabbeinu? I can't make this up. Who was Moshe Rabbeinu? Gee, I don't know. I'll tell you another story. There was a rabbi went to a secular school teaching them about Shavuot. So the principal said, you can't say anything about Torah. You can't say anything. Don't try and convert them, nothing. You had to sign the document saying that. They said, fine. Started teaching them a little bit about Shavuot. And, he's talking about King David. Right? So he asked the question, 400 secular students. 400 Israelis, not Americans. 400 secular Israelis. And the principal's there. And he asked, okay, who wrote the book of Psalms? Who wrote Tehillim? No answer. Nobody knew. 400 kids in Israel don't know who wrote Tehillim. Right? Who wrote the book of Psalms? So this rabbi asked them, he said, okay, I'll give you a hint. He said, I'll give you a hint. David, right, as in David HaMelech, King David, and they said, Ben Gurion. The teacher didn't have anywhere to hide. Talk about ignorance. Had no place to hide, totally embarrassed. Imagine, David Ben Gurion wrote the book of Psalms. But yeah, we're our own worst enemy. Plenty of people, I've never really met an Orthodox Jew. They don't know anything about what we do, what we think. Think, oh, it's a big cult, it's a big this. They have no idea until they meet someone, they speak to them. And some people say, oh, you're not like everyone else. Well, what's everybody else? If I would say you were all like this, isn't that being racist? If I would say all blacks are this, all Chinese are like that, all rednecks are like this. They said, no, you're different. You just made a racist statement. So, we need to do what we need to do. We need to be the best at what we do. We don't want to give anybody, Jew or non-Jew, a negative thing to say. Not one thing. Not one. Because once we do that, the damage is done. I'm not saying it can't be undone. I'm not saying that. But, once damage is done and they have an idea, oh, this is this is what Orthodox Jews are. You could have made an innocent mistake. An innocent mistake. You get hammered. Why? You're held to a higher standard. We Jews are held to a higher standard. We should be. We definitely should be, but we have an awesome responsibility. Non-Jews, it's easier. You can have a positive effect. Not saying not. But it's hard. Again, I have students that their families are rabid anti-Semites. Boy, that sounds like fun. And I know plenty of people, got some of my own family, also anti-Semites, self-hating Jews. Okay? Get them on both sides. On both sides. It's hard. I understand where it comes from, but you know what? There's not much we can do about it. Everybody knows they wanted any Jewish education, they'll come to me. Right? Family-wise. I don't have any takers, so I have to help you. Get out myself, okay? It's probably part of my therapeutic, it's part of the therapy I have to go through myself. They say someone can't help someone when they're stuck in jail. That's what it's like. So I can help others. Very good. People can learn from my mistakes and, and other things. Very good. Right? I don't guarantee you. I do know full families that have, that have become religious and whatever. It's a beautiful thing. I know other families totally split. The families don't speak to each other. People that became religious. Or speak, marginally, whatever. Eventually, once you become religious, and you go this way, you don't have much in common. right? I speak to a relative. What are they going to speak about? They'll speak about how much they hate Trump. It's still going on. What are they going to speak about now? Playoffs, right? Start of basketball season, hockey season. They'll speak about movies, this and that. So what do I have in contact with that? Not much. I'm not following it that much. So it's hard. Definitely hard. I would say that, yeah, we can have a positive effect. But the reality is you do what you need to do. And we be the best we can be. And, if they see it and they see that lifestyle, whatever, they take it to heart, very good. If they say, well, you're a wacko and this and that, whatever. Okay. You still got to do what you got to do. It doesn't matter what other people do. That's a mistake also. People say, oh, I saw this person do this. I saw this person do that. Right. And do other things. So I don't do that. So I don't have to, so I don't have to do other things. Who says? Just because someone did something wrong doesn't mean it's right. Give one example. Someone tells me I saw an Orthodox Jew in a casino. I said, okay. They said, what were they doing in a casino? I said, probably gambling, having a good time. They said, yeah, but according to your religion, right? Secular Jews say this. According to your religion, what are they doing there? You say it's forbidden. I said, right. So what are they doing there? I said, go ask them. Don't ask me. I have enough time answering for myself. Right? Why are people overweight? Why do people smoke? Why do people do other things? Don't ask me that. Ask them that. I have to answer for myself. But people will say, oh, I saw this person do this, saw this person do that. Okay. There are plenty of, there are Orthodox Jews that do the wrong thing. Okay. Doesn't mean the Torah's not true. And that has nothing to do with your obligation to Torah either. See, that's just a smokescreen. Right? They're going to say, well, I don't do this. I had someone tell me this. I don't do this. This person got caught for fraud, let's say. This Orthodox Jew. Go into jail. I don't do that. So if I don't do that, who says I have to keep the mitzvahs? Well, what does that have to do with this Orthodox Jew who got caught with fraud? I'm not going to ask you after 120 years, what about that Orthodox Jew? Go deal with that Orthodox Jew also. But you have to answer for yourself. God's going to say, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you reach your potential? You have to answer. Doesn't matter what someone else did. That's called, a third and long. That's called a punt. It's not an answer. It's called pass the buck. Now, someone, grew up, 80 years ago and said, well, when I went to Hebrew school, my Rebbe hit me and that's what Judaism is. Sounding like a broken record. I said, who says? Maybe the Rebbe had a bad day. They said, no, if that's what Judaism is, it's an excuse to say I don't have anything to do with Judaism. So I heard the rebel line should be well. One say, imagine kids in 4th grade, 5th grade. And what happened? Yeah, he has a bad teacher. Everyone agrees he had a bad teacher. Okay? So what does he say? That's it. I'm going to go out and get a job, right? Kids 10 years old. We don't need no education. What are you, crazy? No one's ever going to do that. Everyone agrees he had a bad teacher. Might need therapy. Okay. But you're not going to throw everything out because he said I had a bad teacher. No more education. That makes sense. Right? But people make excuses all the time. You say, oh, this happened, that happened. This is the Teflon cream puff generation. Any little thing, nope, I'm done. Well, you're still going to be liable. You're still going to be liable for your actions. Whatever, it's a big topic. I tell you to go on to my YouTube channel at Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism. Go in the Q&As, whatever. I just gave you a short version, but there's a lot to talk about. A lot to talk about that topic. Any case, I got another class coming up, so I'm going to sign out. But if you have any, questions or follow-ups, definitely send me an email and do my best to get back to you. Otherwise, we'll be on for next week. That's the way definitely it looks. Otherwise, I'm going to sign out. Wish everyone a good middle of the day, almost end of the day for me. And everyone have a great rest of the week.
You are currently the only person in this conference.